The next crisis is months away as defaults have started. I'm your host, Steve Van Metre, and thanks for joining me today. And over the next 2 months, the news is going to start talking about two crises that are going to hit at the same time. The first one is the car loan crisis. It's going to be immediately followed by the rental crisis. Let's pick up today's story with this headline that it sure feels like a car loan crisis is coming. And there could be bad news around the corner as more and more car buyers are having difficulty keeping up with auto loan payments. According to a recent report from Automotive News, 1.63% of auto loans haven't received a payment in the last 60 days. And that number is 0.4% higher than it was the same time last year and the highest in the past 4 years. An ominous warning. That being said, car loan default rates are still below pre-pandemic levels, and borrowers who took out auto loans in the second and third quarters of 2020 are keeping up with them at better than pre-pandemic borrowers. But auto loans in the second and third quarters of 2021 are starting to show similar delinquency rates as that from before COVID-19. And so what we're hearing is people that actually kind of held their jobs through the pandemic and went out and bought cars, well, they're more likely to be making their payments. Those who lost their jobs or were put out on unemployment for a while, came back, bought cars, are now facing the same problem as they had before, which is a slowing economy and higher unemployment claims. Merchant says inflation and interest rates can increase delinquencies, but unemployment was the most likely metric for the industry to watch. And finally, someone who gets it. Now, the Fred database, which is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, they don't have delinquency rates on auto loans, so we're going to use credit card loans as a proxy just to show you that initial unemployment claims do matter here, and that's probably the driving force. So in red, we have the 4-week moving average of initial claims. In blue, we have the delinquency rate on credit cards, and what you can see as claims start to move higher, then what happens? All of a sudden, you see delinquencies go higher as people can't afford those payments because they're not working. Again, we see claims rising, delinquencies rising, claims rising, delinquencies headed higher. Now, notably, in 2016 through 2020, claims were kind of flattening out and just starting to curve upwards. But notice the delinquencies are rising, suggesting that there were already problems with the economy. And it tells us that coming forward here, delinquencies are going to continue higher as unemployment claims continue to rise. Let's continue on with the story because this all begs the question, if delinquency rates are up, then why aren't repossessions? Well, the outlet reports Equifax found that 2.14% of auto loans in the first 6 months of this year were more than 120 days behind on payments. That criteria classifies them as a default. It's not a great number, but it's much lower than the 2.9% rate from 2019. Remember, where it starts is not where it ends. As it's reported that when all is said and done in 2022, the default rate would reach 2.3%, which would be the lowest level in the past 15 years. And historically, about 80% of defaults in repossessions, and the repossession rate is also likely to be lower in 2022 than in 2019. And of course, what this means is as the economy continues to slow down, and that's what everyone's missing here. They're saying, well, the economy's not going to slow down, but we're seeing proof and evidence in the leading indicators the economy is slowing down. This means these delinquency rates are going to head higher, as are repossession rates. And then wait till 2023 hits, it's going to be even worse. So what does all this tell us? Well, from the looks of it, more and more people are falling a month or two behind on their auto loans, but they're not letting the delinquencies lead to defaults. That's a good thing. As for this behavior is sustainable, well, that's anyone's guess. Now remember, 2008, when everyone was unable to pay their mortgage, well, according to this author, feels familiar to them. And that's kind of what, you wonder, well, why are people hanging on? Well, think about what the Fed is telling us. They're telling us that, hey, this slowdown is a first half issue. The economy is still strong. Hey, can't you see the non-farm payroll reports? If you're out of work, don't worry. Someone will hire you. And the second half of the year is getting even better. What did we hear from the Biden administration out of the White House? Hey, don't worry about this, 2 quarters of contraction. Technically, it's a recession. But don't worry, recessions are often over before you even realize they started. Everything's going to be okay in the second half. What are we hearing from bank analysts? Same story. Buy stocks. The economy, we just had a little speed bump, a little slowdown. It's going to boom in the second half. And so if you're facing, struggling making payments on your debt, but you're being told that things are going to get better, you don't want to lose that car. What are you going to do? It means you're going to scrape together the money, try to keep that thing out of default, and hope that maybe the economy shines on you. But is the story about repossessions true? Well, maybe not so much, as vehicle repossessions are surging. Also, according to a recent report from dealers to lenders to tow truck operators, reports have poured in this month about a disturbing trend in rising car and truck repossessions. And of course, we note that these repossessions have doubled among prime borrowers, something you wouldn't expect, which includes consumers with good credit scores. And one red flag is the rate of repossessions for prime borrowers is rising. It's not just subprime this time that are having problems, showing and indicating this is a broad slowdown in the economy is real. And the reasons for the sharp increase in repossessions is not exactly clear, although it is because, well, the unemployment claims are rising. Some point to a bubble in the car market that was caused by rapidly rising prices due to a shortage of new cars and trucks. While some economists think the pandemic stimulus, and extra unemployment benefits, you've got it, may have played a role in pushing up the price of used vehicles. Now the stimulus money has been spent and all the extra unemployment benefits have expired, some consumers who overspent on a vehicle are struggling to keep up with their payments, especially now that inflation makes everything else more expensive. And that's kind of what we saw here. The whole global economy got pumped up on fiscal and monetary stimulus. We're withdrawing it, where it turns out that the economy isn't that strong to begin with. It was already slowing down going into the pandemic, and now it's just becoming obvious that as this high frequency leading data starts to indicate, the global economy is slowing down and tends to enter recession after there's periods of high employment. The probabilities are high that we're headed to something worse. But one thing that shouldn't be headed to something worse is your portfolio. I'll put a link up here to Portfolio Shield in the corner and description below, because when economies deflate, well, interest rates crash, and strategies like Portfolio Shield hedge. Now, what is coming, though, is something worse than just the subprime auto default blow up. Well, the rental market, wait till you see this. It's a perfect storm of what's coming later this year, as a snowballing U.S. rental crisis is sparing nowhere and no one, as renters across cities and income brackets are struggling to find new homes or pay for the ones they already live in. And rental costs in the U.S. are soaring at the fastest pace in more than 3 decades, surpassing a median of $2,000 a month for the first time ever and pushing rents above pre-pandemic levels in most major cities. Increases are particularly steep in metropolitan areas that saw large influxes of new residents during the pandemic, but the rental market is sparing almost nowhere and no one. And many renters who typically spend a greater share of their income on housing than homeowners are already struggling to keep up with larger bills at the grocery store and the gas station, thanks to inflation running near the highest in 4 decades. And that's what happens here. When inflation takes off, it's all fun and games. Everyone's, oh, good. Finally, we're going to see higher prices. I'm going to be able to charge more for my goods and services, can make a little bit more money. And then what happens over time, it starts getting into things that we don't like: food, fuel, utilities, and then all of a sudden, rents. And when rent inflation comes, it's brutal. Because as rent hikes are expected and persistently push up inflation higher, since leases are staggered and renters face shocks at different times. Shelter costs account for about a third of the closely watched consumer price index, which increased by 8.5% in July from a year earlier, suggesting that inflation may stay high. Single-family rents rose by a record 14% nationally in May from a year earlier, according to a real estate data firm. The increases were even more dramatic in cities that became popular living destinations during the pandemic, including an almost 40% increase in Miami, 25% rise in Orlando, and 17% jump in Phoenix. And some 5.4 million households, or 40% of households that are not current on their rent or mortgage payments, said they were likely to be evicted or foreclosed in the next 2 months. And you start to connect these two is, hey, wait a minute, why are people missing payments on their cars and headed into default? Oh, it's because they can't make their rent payments either. Inflation's too high. Their wages aren't keeping up with it. Unemployment rates are starting to go up as they're facing job losses. We're seeing more news about companies laying off than we are hiring, despite, again, government's claim that, hey, look at the non-farm payroll report, this lagging indicator that's smoothed out and suggesting that, look, there's all these jobs being created, but it's not actually what's happening here. And that means this is the highest share. Look at this, the highest share since the census started asking the question in August 2020. So in 2 months from now, things are set to get much worse. And rent increases could drop to a range of 5 to 8% 1 year from now, suggesting that they may just slow down. And it's not clear when the market may return to the low single-digit increases more typical before the pandemic, but putting continued strain on renters. We don't expect dramatic shifts, and perhaps they're right, because when we look at the consumer price index for rent of shelter in the U.S. city average, it's running at 5.8% year over year, but look at this big surge higher. And what we're seeing here again, this is as people's leases come due, they're getting sticker shock. By the way, you knew you were getting a price increase? Well, it's actually more than that. And with inflation in all other parts of the economy, people just can't afford certain things. They can't spend as much money on food, energy, cars, you name it, it's all filtering downhill. But can the Fed stop it? That's the question you're probably asking. Can monetary policy fix this? And the answer is, well, in a sense, it can, because you can see periods where rents are rising, shown in blue here, overlaid with the federal funds rate. Well, as the Fed continues to tighten, you do see a slowing of rents. Of course, that usually comes with a recession. And sure enough, rents start to slow and heading into recession. Can they contract? Well, they can, but it's not very common. More likely what happens is the economy enters recession, rents slow as demand slows with it. And now, how about when we overlay the delinquency rate in credit cards against rent increases, and you starts to make sense of people are just strapped. They cannot afford higher prices. And sure enough, here you can see in blue, the consumer price index for rent, staying elevated here, and delinquencies rates are rising. Rents going up, delinquency rates fall. Rents up with a lag, delinquency rates. It's not that people don't want to be able to make their payments. It's a function of they can't. And with that, we're going to step back into yesterday's show with a follow-up from our chief strategist, Jeffrey Snyder, who talks about the unemployment claims and what that means. In his daily here, he notes the average for jobless claims declined for the first time in 2 months, having risen at a near steady pace going back to mid-March. And he says high-frequency data month to month is noticeably noisy to begin with, so week to week can be tricky. He said it will take some time before we see whether there's been a change in trend or if the decline in the average represents nothing more than the usual statistical noise. Now, if you want to know more about what Jeff Snyder, Tracy Schuchart, and I have to say in our daily report, well, be sure to check out Markets Insider Pro, link in the description below. And with that, my friends, I appreciate you being fans, appreciate you watching. I'm Steve Van Metre. Bye now.